There is a sentence that many people are afraid to say out loud, even though entire areas of law, medicine, safeguarding, and sport still depend on it. That sentence is gender matters. It matters in medicine, it matters in data, it matters in prisons, it matters in sport, it matters in safeguarding, it matters in language that we use, and the most important thing is that it matters in women's lives. And what I mean by saying women, I mean biological women. That's the only type of women I am personally aware of. Now, before anybody tries to flatten this conversation into something lazy or hysterical, let me say this clearly at the very beginning. This video is not about hatred, cruelty, or demeaning anyone. It is not about mocking trans people. It is not about denying that some people experience profound distress around identity, body, and belonging. It is not about personal spy. It is purely about public policy. Because the moment an issue leaves the private realm and enters law, institutions, schools, prisons, hospitals, sports, statistics, and safeguarding, it can no longer be handled with slogans. And that is exactly what has gone wrong in here. For years now, a great deal of public debate has been dominated by moral blackmail, social pressure, and emotional intimidation. People have been told that if they insist on retaining sex-based categories, they are cruel. If they ask for accurate language, they are bigots. If they defend female-only spaces, they are hateful. If they want reliable statistics on male violence, women's health, or sex differences, they are somehow following a compassion test. But compassion is not the same thing as confusion. And the refusal to confuse sex with identity is not hatred. In fact, I would argue that one of the most dangerous habits of modern politics is pretending that reality itself is offensive to anyone. Because once a society starts treating factual categories as moral threats, it becomes incapable of making sane policies. And women pay the price first, not because women are weak, not because women cannot cope, not because female people have historically needed sex-based boundaries, sex-based protections, and sex-based language, precisely because our bodies, our reproductive roles, our vulnerability to male violence, and our social realities are not imaginary. They are very real. And when politics becomes so ideological that it starts dissolving the category of woman into self-declared identity, women lose something very serious, and that's clarity. Clarity in law, clarity in medicine, clarity in actual data, clarity in rights, clarity in who protections are for and why they actually exist in the first place. So today I want to do something unfashionable. I want to defend sex-based rights. I want to defend reality-based policy. And I want to explain why this matters, not only for women, but for a whole of a functioning society. Because you cannot build fair laws on top of conceptual chaos. And that's what we have been doing for the last few decades. You cannot protect women if you are not allowed to define what women are. And you cannot fix a problem you are forbidden to even name, like it's Lord Voldemort from Harry Potter. Let's begin with the most basic point of all. A civilization that cannot define its categories cannot defend its boundaries. That is absolutely not complicated to understand, and it shouldn't be for any adult or a teenager at this point. If the word woman means adult human female, then sex-based rights make sense. If the word woman means anyone who identifies into the category, then women's rights stop being sex-based and become identity-based. That is not a small change. This is what this whole argument is about. Because once womanhood becomes a matter of declaration rather than sex, every female-only law, service, dataset, quota, safeguarding policy, hospital pathway, prison rule, or sports category becomes extremely unstable. And people know this. They absolutely know it. That is why so much energy has gone into pressuring the public not to ask basic question. What is the category? Who is included? Who is excluded? What is the purpose of the boundary? What problem was the boundary designed to actually solve? In the United Kingdom, this debate became legally concrete. The Equality and Human Rights Commission said that after the UK Supreme Court ruling on the Equality Act, sex for Equality Act purposes is interpreted as biological sex only. And that obtaining a gender recognition certificate does not change your legal sex for Equality Act purposes. The EHRC's guidance on single-sex services also states that law permits single-sex services and in some cases allows providers to limit or modify access for trans people where that is proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim such as privacy, decency, preventing trauma or health and safety. And that matters enormously because it tells you something fundamental. Sex-based law exists for a reason. Not because legislators were mean, not because history was primitive, not because women's rights campaigners lacked imagination, but because human beings as sexed bodies and public policy sometimes has to deal with the consequences of that, okay? This is where the activist line, trans women are women, becomes so politically loaded. As a social courtesy, in private life, people can use whatever language they choose. But in public policy, that sentence is not neutral. It does work. It changes definitions, it changes eligibility, it changes rights, it changes language, it changes the default answer to who belongs where. And the minute the state or universities or schools or hospitals or prisons start acting as though identity overrides sex in every context, women become the sides expected to absorb the cost of that narrative. The cost is usually disguised with soft language. Be kind, be inclusive, be compassionate, be affirming, and be modern. And I would like to remind you that behind all that emotional packaging is a very hard political demand. Women must surrender sex-based clarity so that identity claims are never made uncomfortable. That does not sound like equality to me. That is one group behind being told to give way indefinitely while pretending nothing meaningful has changed. And I think women are increasingly tired of being told to smile while their legal and social category is philosophically dissolved in front of them. One of the most manipulative tricks in this debate is pretending that sex-based boundaries are random relics of prejudice. They are most definitely not. They exist because sex matters in predictable ways. And for the purpose of this argument, sex and gender are the exact same things to me. Female-only spaces were not invented because women wanted drama. They were created because women as a class have distinct needs around privacy, safety, dignity, trauma, bodily exposure, and vulnerability to male violence. That is true in domestic violence refugees. It is true in rape crisis services. It is true in hospital wards, in changing rooms, in prisons, in toilets, in sport, in health screening and data collection. EHRC guidance is very explicit that single-sex services may be justified for privacy, decency, preventing trauma, and health and safety. That language in itself is not fringe language. That is mainstream equality law language, clear as day. And that matters because so much activist rhetoric tries to reframe female boundaries as irrational feelings rather than practical safeguards. Women are told they are bigoted if they do not want male-bodied people in intimate spaces. This is where this argument sort of goes towards. But that accusation only works if you erase the reason those spaces existed in the first place. A woman in a changing room is not making a philosophical statement. A rape survivor in a refugee is not making a cultural war argument. A female prisoner worried about a male-bodied inmate is not engaging in any abstract theories. A girl competing in a race is not performing prejudice by noticing bodies that are right next to her. These are embodied realities that we are having to deal with right now. And the really unsettling part is that so much elite discourse now treats women's discomfort as politically embarrassing unless it is expressed in the approved language. Women can talk about trauma, but not male bodies. Women can talk about inclusion, but not exclusion. Women can talk about feelings, but not sex. Women can talk about safety, but only if they never imply that boundaries require a definition. That is absurd. A boundary you are not allowed to define is not a boundary at all anymore. And a right that disappears the moment someone else asserts an identity claim is not a right, it's a courtesy. Women did not fight for rights just to be downgraded into someone else's optional sensitivity setting. A lot of people still underestimate how important language is, especially around this issue. They think this is just about semantics. It is not. Language determines what can be measured, what can be defended, what can be funded, and what can be seen. Once public institutions stop using the word women to mean female people, all kinds of distortions follow. I recently started hearing phrases like bodies with vaginas, pregnant people, people with cervixes, and menstruators, used as replacement for women. Now, sometimes those anatomical phrases have a narrow clinical use, but as a political habit, they reveal something deeper. Women are increasingly expected to accept language that fragments female reality into body parts, while male identity claims are treated as sacred and whole. That does not sound like progress to me. That is a symmetrical difference. It is women who are told to become abstract. It is women who are told to stop naming themselves. It is women who are told that female language is exclusionary. It is women who are told to disappear into inclusive terminology. Meanwhile, the material realities is specific to women who do not disappear just because the language becomes rather evasive. Pregnancy remains sex. Cervical cancer screening remains sex and anatomy based. Fertility remains sexed. Menopause remains sexed. Female vulnerability to male violence remains sexed. Even the NHS's own public information for trans and non-binary people still has to rely on anatomy and sexed realities. It states that trans women assigned male at birth do not need cervical screening because they do not have a cervix. However, having said that, you will not believe me when I say this now, but on NHS, if they are registered as a female, they may still be invited unnecessarily to such screening. That tells you everything. Reality keeps forcing its way back in. Because in medicine, unlike on social media, organs are not bigoted and bodies do not obey ideology. Screening programs, diagnosis, treatment pathways, and risk factors all need sex and anatomical clarity. That is one reason the UK government commissioned Sullivan Review stressed the importance of accurate collection of data and sex and highlighted obstacles created when sex data are lost or replaced with gender identity data. It explicitly warned that loss of accurate sex data affects policy areas including health, crime and justice, and education. And this is exactly why language matters so much. If you corrupt the language, you corrupt the data. If you corrupt the data, you corrupt the policy. If you corrupt the policy, women lose protection. And when women complain, they are told they are overreacting. I think they are just noticing the chain reaction. Language is the first surrender because it trains people to accept the later ones. Once you are bullied into saying sex does not matter, the rest becomes much easier to smuggle through without you noticing. Let's talk about statistics because a state cannot protect what it cannot measure. That is pretty straightforward, I hope, for all of you. If crime data blurs sex and gender identity, you make violence harder to track accurately. If health data blur sex and identity, you undermine sex-specific medicine. If education data blur sex and identity, you weaken analysis of male and female outcomes, which I have spoken about quite a lot on previous videos. If prison data blurs sex and identity, you make risk much harder to understand. This is not anti-anyone. It is simply what categories are for. We have reached a ridiculous point in our time where governments had to commission reviews to remind institutions that sex is a meaningful variable when it comes to data. That should seriously alarm people. Because once data become politicized, the public stops being told what is true and starts being told what is ideologically convenient. And that has very real consequences in the area public cares about the most, which is violence. Sexual offences in England and Wales remain a major issue. The ONS reported over 200,000 police recorded sexual offences in a year ending March 2025. While also cautioning that changes in recording practices and legislations affect long-term trend interpretation. The point is not to sensationalize the number, but to underline that sexual violence is serious, substantial, and exactly the kind of area where accurate sex-based recording really matters. And here is where I want to be careful and very honest. A lot of online channels, they are making sweeping claims about trans offending using weak or selective data. I am not going to do that here. There is not in England and Wales a clean, comprehensive national crime series that lets the public compare offending by sex and gender identity in the simple way activists and counter-activists often pretend exists. The absence of clear data is itself part of the problem. I agree with that. It means the public is expected to make policy judgments while being denied coherent measure, which is the government's responsibility. But what we can say is this. If sex matters for patterns of violence, and if sexual offending is overwhelmingly male in the general population, then replacing sex with identity in official systems makes safeguarding less clear, not more clear. That is common sense, that I know is extremely uncommon these days. It is not a smear against every trans person. It is a criticism of bad record keeping and bad policy design. Because policy should be built around categories that help institutions perceive risk, not categories that flatter ideology. They are supposed to be there to safeguard men and women, not make things politically convenient to talk about. Prisons expose this problem in its most extreme form. If you want to see whether a society really believes sex matters, we have to look at prisons. Because prisons are where the state's moral confusion collides with hard everyday reality. Prisons are not seminar rooms, prisons are not campus debates, and they are certainly not branding exercises in inclusions, okay? They are coercive institutions full of people with histories of violence, trauma, instability, manipulation, sexual offending, and predation. This is why prison policy must be brutally serious. In England and Wales, the HMPPS Offender Equalities Annual Report for 24 to 25 said that as of 31st of March 2025, there were 339 transgender prisoners and that 82 of the 123 prisoners reported having at least one transgender prisoner. That is not a huge number in absolute terms, but the number is not the point in here. The point is what prison placement policy really reveals. Official prison guidance makes clear that these cases require risk assessment and management, and that panels should focus on risk factors and protective factors rather than the prisoner's transgender identity itself. Now, on one level, that sounds quite sensible. Individual risk assessment is obviously better than chaos. But notice what is built into this whole problem. Saying that, the state is effectively acknowledging that identity alone cannot settle placement. Why is that, you may ask yourself? Because sex, body, offending profile, trauma history, anatomy, and risk all very much matter. So when activists say trans women are women, prisons quietly answer, not for every operational purpose, actually. We still need sex reality and risk analysis. Exactly. And that tells you this debate was never merely symbolic. Because if a male-bodied prisoner who identifies as a woman may be a risk to female prisoners, then female prisoners are being asked to bear a cost for ideological conversation. And this is where elite empathy often becomes strangely selective. There is endless rhetorical concern for the dignity of the identity-claiming prisoner. Where is the same energy for female prisoners, many of whom are themselves vulnerable, mentally unwell, previously abused, or a survivor of male violence? Why is it considered compassionate to center one group's identity, but reactionary to center another group's trauma? Why are women always expected to be the morally flexible party? These are not minor questions. A prison is one of the clearest examples of the state's duty to discriminate well. Not discriminate in a cruel way, but discriminate accurately between high risk and low risk, between vulnerable and dangerous, between male and female, between competing claims. And whenever women's prison spaces are treated as merely one interest among many, rather than as a sex-specific safeguarding, something has gone wrong at the level of moral priorities. A society that cannot keep this clear in prison policy will struggle everywhere else too, naturally. Let's talk about sport. For many years, many institutions tried to really avoid the sport question because it is awkward for ideology. In theory, they wanted to say inclusion. In reality, they had to confront physiology. Because sport is not really based on conversational vibes. It is based on bodies, capacity, performance, strength, speed, endurance, power, leverage, lung capacity, and actual data. And once male puberty enters the picture, pretending sex is irrelevant becomes much harder. That is why so many sports bodies have moved toward clearer sex-based restrictions in female categories, even while trying to present those restrictions in carefully managed language. In my opinion, they did it quite late, but we'll get on to that. World Athletics announced in 2025 that athletes wishing to compete in the female category at the World Championships would need a once-in-a-lifetime SRY gene test, with new rules taking effect from 1st of September 2025. Earlier, World Athletics regulations had already excluded transgender women who had experienced male puberty from the female category. That is an extraordinary development because it means one of the world's major sports governing bodies concluded that female competition categories cannot be protected purely by self-identification or hormone thresholds. Again, reality came back, which is nice to see. The IOSC's framework, by contrast, has emphasized inclusion and non-discrimination, encouraging sports bodies to redesign their own eligibility rules. And this is where the public should ask a very simple question. If sex doesn't matter, why do sports keep having to create sex-based rules? If identity is enough, why do governing bodies keep returning to puberty, chromosomes, and physiology? If women's sports is just a social category, why do elite institutions keep acting as though it is a biological one? Guess why? Because it is. And women know it. And I hope many men do too.